Welcome to the Film PM podcast as we continue this series of episodes on how to create a doable, achievable production schedule for your film. This is Jeff Rhodes, and today we're going to talk about estimating. Now, if you're going to create a realistic schedule, you're going to need to have three things. The first is a complete list of all the possible tasks that you're going to need in order to get this film in the can. Now, that's a whole topic in and of itself. It's a whole episode, and it's one we've already covered. The link is in the description, by the way. Don't feel like you have to go look at that one first. There's just three elements. That's one of three. The second element is you need to put all of those tasks, all of those individual things that you're going to have to do into some type of order. That's another episode. Again, the link is in the description. Don't feel like you have to go to that one yet. So while you're here, let's stick with what this topic is, which is the third thing you're going to need to do, which is to figure out how long it's going to take to do each one of those individual tasks. We call that skill estimating. Now, I got to tell you, estimating is not one of the easiest things to do, particularly when you're doing a bunch of it. There's been some skilled people who are real smart and have trouble with it. But we're going to walk through, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to do it. And I think if you embrace the process, what you're going to find is it's not as hard. Well, let me put it this way: it's not as complicated as you may think. Doesn't mean it's not hard. Because there's a lot of work that you have to do to it, but it's not nearly as complicated or as magical as people think. So a couple things before we get into the actual tools and techniques of how to do it. Some basics on what we mean by estimating. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that estimating, by its very nature, is a guess. That's right. You heard me say it. It is a guess. It's supposed to be a thoughtful guess. It's supposed to be one that's supported by information and data and that sort of thing. But ultimately, it's a guess. And people don't like to hear that necessarily. But we have to get that out of the way first. We don't call it a guess because guesses sound bad. So we estimate. Hope is not a good tool to use in estimating. And oftentimes we get pressured into putting something that's very aggressive because we just would like it to take that amount of time when in reality we know it's going to take longer. So one of the disciplines I'm going to have of you to do is to make sure that you really think this is what I think will happen, not my hopes and dreams. Third, an estimate is best expressed. Now, when somebody says, I need an accurate estimate, the best way to express it is as a range. How big of a range can it be? What's acceptable? Well, it really depends. The rule that we use in the estimating game, the more we know about the thing that we're estimating for, the task, the timing, whatever it is that we're trying to estimate for, it's all about information. So the more we know, the tighter that range can be, the more accurate it can be. The less we know. Fourth, estimating is always subject to pressures. Again, because it's a guess, an estimate is very easy to challenge. So oftentimes you'll get people saying, well, why are you saying 2 weeks? I think we can get it done in one. Or they'll pressure you into doing something cheaper because, again, because it's a guess, it's easier to challenge that. But so realize you're going to get pressured into usually tightening up your estimate when the information doesn't support that. So try to avoid that if you can. And finally, estimating is less about formulas, it's less about tricks, and more about investigating, questioning, researching. Like I said a couple minutes ago, the more we know about a task, the more we know about that thing that we're estimating for, the more accurate that estimate can be. So let's walk through in a couple minutes here how to do an estimate. And what we're going to be doing here is what's called a bottom-up estimate, meaning we're doing it from scratch. Step number one for developing an estimate is you want to describe your task. Like I've just said a couple times, the more you know about that task, the more accurate that estimate can be. So you want to learn as much about it as you can. You may know a lot about it. The place where many estimators get in trouble is they come up with a number about something they know very little about. Again, estimating is not about tricks and tips and all that. What estimating is about oftentimes is shoe leather and doing the research and making the calls. It's a little bit more time consuming than a lot of people realize. But that's the trade. And time is something we're trading a lot here. Step two, look to history. Your best source of estimating information is history, meaning historical data, meaning if it took so-and-so a week to paint a house, it's going to take me around a week to paint a similar size house. Now, they may be more skilled, so we adjust it based upon that, but history is going to be our best source of information. And this is where, again, calling around, finding people, getting information is really going to be vital to the process. Another thing that you want to look at here, and this is step three, is look to who is doing the work. Now, I just kind of alluded to that in the previous step, but you want to identify who's doing the actual work, the actual tasks. You may not know at this point, in which case then your estimate is a little bit more of a guess. But if you know who's doing it, if you have a person who's doing the lighting or the art directing or one of these other jobs, that's who you want to turn to. That's who you want to ask questions of, and you want to find out from them. You also may want to look at how many people. That can also affect an estimate. You know, if for some people it takes 3 hours to do a job, theoretically, if there's two people and they're equally skilled, it should only take an hour and a half to do the job. So that's another thing to look at as well, is who's doing the work and how many people do you have doing the work. And then finally, step four, keep it simple. Keep it simple, meaning you might want to just try to come up with some very generic ways of doing some estimate. That's one of the things I did years ago when I was doing a project. I was moving actually, and where I landed was I had created a very robust list of all the things I had to do to move. So it was a huge list. It was a big list. But what I discovered is most of those tasks were fairly similar. I could put most tasks as 4 hours long or half a day, meaning pack a bedroom, for example. That's something I could do after work. So I was trying to identify those tasks that I could do after work once I was finished my workday versus those tasks that were going to take a lot longer. So what I found was most of the tasks were half-day tasks. Then there was a smaller series of tasks that took a whole day. Those are the ones I put onto the weekend. And then there were 3 or 4 very unique tasks, which I just did as a separate estimate. So for most of the estimating, most of the tasks, I had a couple set ways I was doing it, which is a nice little shortcut. So it's a way of keeping it simple, but still respecting that there's a lot going on with these different tasks. A couple tips here before we go. So that's the methodology there. Define your task, look to history, find out who's doing the work and how many people there are, and then keep it simple if you can. A couple tips here. The first tip: use the same unit of measurement, either hours or days or weeks. You know, a lot of times in pre-production, I've seen this in schedules in Hollywood movies. A lot of times pre-production is done in week chunks. They don't get very specific. Once they get into production, they change that unit of measurement to days and hours, and they get more refined with it because there's a lot of money at stake when you're actually shooting and everybody's there. But prior to that, it was by weeks. But that way you can compare one task to another if they're using the same unit of measurement. So you want to figure that out. Because it is a guess, you want to also what we call document your assumptions. And all that means is if you came up with a number and there was a reason you came up with a number, you're eventually going to forget where you came up with that number. All we say is you write down how you came up with that number at the bottom of that estimate. Particularly if it looks funny or if it doesn't quite make sense just looking at it as a number, you want to write down what you mean by that. So for example, you may say, assuming that the weather is good, 4 weeks. And then last but certainly not least, the last tip I want to give here, last thing I want to say is no matter how much of this work you do, what you'll probably find is that it still takes longer than you think. Be patient with it. Play with it. Work with it. Realize that when you're doing estimating, it's not easy to do. Okay? It's not complicated, but it's not easy. Stick with it. Work the process. Use your work forms. Use your spreadsheets. And what you're going to find is that you're going to have a very realistic schedule. And that is a professional look. When you can have a realistic schedule, that's what professionals look to. This is Jeff Rhodes from Film PM. Good luck. And hey, let's get that film made.